The Haunting of Hollow Grove. In the fading light of a crisp autumn evening, Ethan, a seasoned hiker, ventured into Hollow Grove, a forest known for its eerie folklore. Local legends whispered of a monstrous entity that prowled the woods at dusk, a creature shrouded in darkness with eyes that gleamed like embers and a gnarled body that melted into the shadows. These stories were dismissed by most as mere tales, but the allure of the unknown drew Ethan deeper into the heart of the grove. As he navigated the labyrinth of ancient trees, the air grew colder, and an unsettling silence descended. The usual forest sounds, the rustling leaves, the distant chirps, vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. A dense fog began to coil around the trees, creating ghostly silhouettes and distorting his sense of direction. Ethan stumbled upon a clearing bathed in the pale glow of the rising moon. In its center stood an old, decrepit cabin, half swallowed by the forest's relentless grasp. Curiosity piqued, he approached cautiously. The cabin's door, hanging by a single hinge, creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to devour the light. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The remnants of a once cozy interior were scattered around. A shattered mirror, a moth-eaten armchair, and a fireplace filled with ash, long settled. A strange, rhythmic thumping echoed from the walls, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he moved closer to the source of the sound, now perceiving it as a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, he pried up the rotting wood, revealing a hidden compartment. As the last plank gave way, an overpowering stench of decay filled the room. Ethan recoiled, but curiosity compelled him to peer inside. He saw a mass of matted fur and twisted limbs, the remnants of some grotesque, long-dead creature. Its eyes, lifeless yet haunting, stared up at him, and in that moment, the heartbeat ceased. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, and he stumbled backward, knocking over a rusted lantern. The impact sparked a small flame that quickly spread, igniting the dry wood of the cabin. Panic set in as the fire grew, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. Ethan dashed for the door, the cabin now a blazing inferno. Just as he reached the threshold, he felt a cold, clawed hand grip his ankle. He looked down to see the monster, now animate, emerging from the flames, its eyes burning with a malevolent fury. It pulled him back into the cabin, where the fire roared and the walls groaned under the heat's intensity. Screams echoed through Hollow Grove that night, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. By dawn, the cabin was reduced to ashes, and Ethan was never seen again. To this day, locals avoid Hollow Grove, especially at dusk. They speak of the forest reclaiming its own, and of a creature that, though once dead, now wanders restlessly, searching for its next victim. The legend warns that those who dare disturb the grove's sinister secret will find themselves trapped, like Ethan, in the embrace of the monster that haunts the shadows. The Return of Wicker Hollow. In the heart of Maine lies Wicker Hollow, a small town long abandoned and shrouded in mystery. The air is thick with the scent of decay, and the buildings, once vibrant with life, now stand as hollow shells, mere whispers of a forgotten past. The only living souls are a handful of survivors who return once a year, compelled by a tradition that none dare break. This year, the group was smaller than ever. Emily, a history professor, had been coming to Wicker Hollow for 5 years. She believed the town's dark history was worth preserving. Tom, a former soldier, joined for reasons he kept to himself. Lucas, an amateur filmmaker, hoped to capture something that would make his career. And Jane, Emily's former student, was dragged along by her insatiable curiosity and a desire to impress her mentor. As the group arrived, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows. The sky, streaked with blood-red hues, seemed to warn of the horrors to come. They set up camp in the town square, the heart of Wicker Hollow, where the annual ritual was to take place. The tradition was simple: light a bonfire and stay the night. The Those who stayed would be rewarded with the truth of the town's curse. Emily gathered the group around the fire, her face illuminated by its flickering glow. Wicker Hollow was once a bustling town, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But in 1887, a mysterious illness swept through, turning the townspeople into something else. Zombies, Lucas interjected, eager to make his mark on the conversation. Not zombies, Emily corrected. Not exactly. The disease reanimated the dead, but these creatures were driven by a hunger not for flesh, but for the very essence of life itself. Tom's eyes narrowed. You're saying they're still here? Emily nodded. They walk the streets every night, trapped between life and death. The bonfire is meant to keep them at bay, but it's only a temporary measure. As if on cue, a cold wind swept through the square, causing the fire to dance and sputter. The air grew thick with an unnatural chill, and the survivors huddled closer together. Jane, her face pale, asked, "What happens if the fire goes out?" Emily's gaze turned solemn. "Then we become part of the town's curse. The dead will rise and claim us as their own." The group sat in silence, the weight of Emily's words hanging heavy in the air. The night wore on, and despite the fire's warmth, an icy fear settled into their bones. The town seemed to come alive, with the wind whispering secrets through the cracks in the walls and the shadows shifting with a life of their own. Just after midnight, the wind grew stronger, howling through the deserted streets. The fire flickered violently and a chill ran down Emily's spine. "We need more wood," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the only thing keeping them away." Tom stood, his jaw set. "I'll get it. I'll go with you," Jane offered, her voice shaking but resolute. They ventured into the darkness, their flashlights barely piercing the inky blackness. The town seemed to close in around them, the silence oppressive and suffocating. They reached an old, dilapidated house, its windows shattered and doors hanging askew. "Quick," Tom urged, grabbing a few broken boards and tossing them to Jane. As they turned to leave, a sound behind them made them freeze. A low, guttural moan, followed by the shuffling of feet. Tom's flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on a figure standing in the doorway. Its eyes were vacant, skin sallow and decayed, and it moved with a slow, deliberate gait. It wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruders. "Run!" Tom shouted, grabbing Jane's hand and pulling her towards the door. They sprinted back to the square, hearts pounding, with the undead in close pursuit. The fire was almost out, its light dimming with every passing second. Lucas and Emily frantically threw wood onto the flames, but it was too late. The first of the creatures reached the edge of the square, its lifeless eyes reflecting the dying fire. "Get back!" Tom yelled, brandishing a flaming stick. But the creatures pressed on, undeterred by the weak light. Emily grabbed a handful of salt from her bag, a relic from her research, and threw it at the approaching horde. The creatures recoiled, hissing and retreating from the barrier. "It's working!" she cried, her voice tinged with relief. "Salt keeps them away!" The group scrambled to create a circle of salt around the fire, but their supply was limited. As the last grains fell, a creature lunged, breaking through the barrier and dragging Lucas into the darkness. His screams echoed through the square, sending a wave of terror through the survivors. "We have to go," Tom urged, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." Emily nodded, her face pale. "To the church," she said, pointing to a building on the edge of town. "It's the only place left with any real protection." They ran through the streets, the undead hot on their heels. The church loomed ahead, its doors ajar as if beckoning them to safety. They burst through the doors and slammed them shut, barricading them with pews and whatever else they could find. The church was dark and cold, its air heavy with centuries of prayer and despair. They huddled together, listening to the sounds of the undead clawing at the doors, their moans a constant reminder of the horror waiting outside. "We're safe here," Emily said, trying to reassure the others. "The church was consecrated ground. They can't enter." Tom's eyes scanned the darkened room, his mind racing. For how long? he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's gaze met his, and the truth was clear. They were trapped, surrounded by the dead, with no hope of escape. The night stretched on, the moans outside growing louder and more desperate. As dawn approached, the sounds began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. The survivors knew they couldn't stay. The curse of Wicker Hollow was relentless, and it would claim them if they remained. With the first light of day, they ventured out, moving quickly and silently through the empty streets. The undead had retreated, leaving only their decayed footprints in the dust. The town was a tomb, a place where the dead ruled, and the living were merely intruders. As they left Wicker Hollow behind, Emily turned for one last look. The town stood silent and still, a monument to a darkness that could never be truly vanquished. She knew they would never return. The truth of Wicker Hollow's curse was now etched in their souls, a nightmare that would haunt them forever. The survivors never spoke of that night again, but they carried the memory with them, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows of forgotten places. And as Wicker Hollow faded into the distance, the wind whispered its secrets, a mournful lament for the lives lost to its curse. The haunting of Blackwood Manor. The Winchester family arrives at Blackwood Manor in the late afternoon. The mansion, once grand and opulent, now stands in a state of decay, with ivy creeping up its cracked stone walls. The dense forest that surrounds the estate casts long shadows over the property, creating an atmosphere of unease. The family, consisting of parents John and Elizabeth and their two children, Sophie and Ben, step out of their car and stare up at their new home, a mix of curiosity and dread in their eyes. As night falls, the family begins exploring the manor. They wander through darkened hallways lined with dusty portraits and tattered drapes. The wooden floors creak underfoot, and the air is thick with the scent of mold and decay. In the flickering light of their candles, they glimpse strange symbols carved into the walls and hear whispers echoing through the empty rooms. Sophie and Ben, curious and adventurous, stumble upon a hidden room behind a bookshelf in the library. The room is filled with strange, ancient artifacts and a large, dusty mirror that seems to hum with energy. As they approach the mirror, they see distorted reflections of themselves, and behind them, shadowy figures that vanish when they turn around. That night, the family tries to settle in, but the manor is far from peaceful. Elizabeth is awakened by the sound of soft crying coming from the hallway. She gets up to investigate, only to find the hallway empty. As she turns back to her room, she catches a glimpse of a ghostly figure standing at the end of the hall, its face obscured, watching her silently. Over the next few days, the hauntings intensify. Objects move on their own, doors slam shut, and the children begin having terrifying nightmares. The parents discover an old journal in the attic that details the dark history of Blackwood Manor, revealing that the previous owners dabbled in forbidden rituals to communicate with the dead. The more they read, the more the family realizes that they are not alone in the house, and the spirits are growing restless. One night, as a storm rages outside, Sophie begins acting strangely. Her eyes become vacant, and she speaks in a voice that is not her own, reciting strange incantations. The family watches in horror as she levitates above her bed, her body twisting unnaturally. It becomes clear that one of the spirits has taken control of her, and they must find a way to save her before it's too late. Desperate to save their daughter, the family decides to confront the spirit. They perform a ritual from the journal in the grand, decrepit ballroom of the manor. The room is filled with candles and symbols drawn on the floor in chalk. As they begin the ritual, the temperature drops, and the air becomes thick with a malevolent presence. Suddenly, the spirit materializes before them, a twisted, vengeful apparition with hollow eyes and a menacing grin. The ritual doesn't go as planned, The spirit becomes enraged, and the manor begins to shake violently. Windows shatter, and walls crack as the spirit's power grows. The family realizes they must flee or be trapped forever. They race through the crumbling mansion, pursued by the vengeful spirit, and barely escape as the front doors slam shut behind them, sealing the evil within. The family stands outside the manor, breathless and shaken. The once grand estate now lies in ruins, its windows dark and lifeless. The storm has passed, and the first light of dawn begins to break through the trees. As they look back at the house, they know they are safe for now, but the haunting memory of Blackwood Manor will stay with them forever. The Crawling Hunger. The old house had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, and its wooden frame sagging like rotting flesh. No one in the town dared to enter it, save for Nathan, a skeptic who laughed at ghost stories. Determined to prove there was nothing there, he grabbed a flashlight and ventured inside. The stench hit him immediately, thick and rancid like spoiled meat. His steps creaked loudly on the moldy floorboards, each groan of the wood echoing through the empty rooms. He smirked, shaking his head at the silence. Nothing, until he heard it. A soft squelching, like something wet dragging itself across the floor. Nathan froze, his blood running cold. The sound grew louder, closer. He swung his flashlight wildly, the beam trembling in his shaking hand. There was nothing in front of him but the noise. It came from behind. He turned slowly, and there, emerging from the shadowed hallway, was a mass of glistening flesh. It had no eyes, no face, just a heap of raw, pulsating skin. Its form undulated and twitched, dragging itself forward with thick tendrils that stuck to the floor, leaving a trail of blood and bile. Nathan stepped back, bile rising in his throat. The thing moved faster, its hunger palpable in the air. It smelled like rot and death, like something ancient and ravenous. Desperate, he turned to flee, but his legs felt heavy, stuck. He looked down. His shoes were covered in a thick, viscous fluid, and to his horror, he saw his own skin beginning to melt. Flesh slid from his bones, sloughing off in chunks, revealing raw muscle and exposed nerves. He screamed, but it was swallowed by the thick, wet gurgle of the creature. It lunged at him, engulfing him in its putrid mass. As it did, his body convulsed, his skin dissolving like wax, absorbed into the grotesque heap. His last conscious thought was of the unimaginable pain, the way his bones splintered, the sensation of his organs being consumed one by one, until he was no more than a part of the thing itself. The house stood silent again, the only trace of Nathan, a few scattered teeth, and a smear of blood on the floor. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the faintest hint of something wet, something hungry. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.